All right, folks, I think we're ready to get started. First, thank you all for joining us. This is a digital town hall about Pepco's proposed rate hike and the need for a publicly owned energy system. My name is Harry Samuels, and I'm a member of DSA, Eco-Socialist Working Group, and an organizer with We Power DC. As we begin, I actually would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we are on. As many of us may know, we are living on colonized land, and it is important for each of us to acknowledge and understand the indigenous people that lived here before us and continue to live here with us, since much of our understanding of indigenous culture and history has been erased by our education systems and frankly by past environmental movements. I know we're all calling in from different locations today, so I'm going to verbally acknowledge the land that I am on, and I would like each of you to visit the website that we will drop in the chat so you can look up your address and learn about the indigenous people that lived there before you. So today, I'm on occupied Nacotchtank land. The Nacotchtank were part of the Piscataway chiefdom, and the Nacotchtank village was the largest of the 3 native villages located in this area. The name Anacostia, as in the Anacostia River, is derived from a colonizer version of the Nacotchtank name. Much of DC is also located on occupied Piscataway land, and I encourage all of you to learn about the Piscataway people as well. We Power DC is a coalition made up of members of 350 DC, the Sunrise Movement DC Hub, One DC, JUFJ, and the Metro DC DSA. Our priority is moving toward a publicly owned utility here in the district. We evolved from the No Pepco pledge, which was a movement to get candidates for DC City Council to promise not to take campaign contributions from Pepco. Several candidates signed on to our pledge, including Janice Lewis George, who's a DSA member and a progressive champion, and she won the Ward 4 Democratic primary, beating the incumbent, which is really exciting. Now, as We Power DC, we are trying to build awareness of and support for a democratically controlled utility. One reason this is especially important is because right now, in the middle of COVID, Pepco is trying to increase energy rates, even though the pandemic has left many people jobless, whereas with a publicly owned utility, residents would have a say in the price of their utility. Here in DC specifically, the city has set really ambitious clean energy goals, like 100% renewable energy by 2032, and Pepco is falling short of those goals, and there is no plan to ensure that they meet them by the deadline. If we own the utility, we could make sure climate goals were a priority. And finally, if we own the utility, the money we pay isn't going into shareholders' pockets, it's going right back into the community. Instead of enriching Pepco shareholders, we could focus on creating good union jobs for our neighbors. Our first order of business as We Power DC is fighting Pepco's proposed price increases and putting public pressure on them and the Public Service Commission, which oversees them, to stop these increases. Our speakers tonight will address the price increases and talk about what's wrong with the current system and what we'd all like to see as an alternative. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a button that says Q&A. Please post your questions there and we'll do our best to answer. Our first speaker is Johanna Bazua. Johanna is a researcher with the Next System Project and an organizer with 350 DC. Go ahead, Johanna.
Hi all, and can we get the slides? I'm not sure they're up yet. Amazing. All right, if we could go to the next slide, the one that says DC Climate Ambition. There we go. Well, Harry has already mentioned this, but DC has made some pretty dramatic commitments to tackling climate change, like reaching 100% renewable energy by 2032, and 10% of that being required to actually be local solar, which is huge and kind of set the scene for a lot of other places across the United States. But even in that room, the utility that we have named Pepco in the district that does regulate or is in charge of our utilities, was actually pushing against some of the provisions that would have allowed us to have more distributed ownership and allow for more economic good within the district. So if we could move to the next slide. And Pepco is part of a larger trope that we have across the United States, in which investor-owned utilities, which are kind of where we are usually getting our electricity from, they're monopolies that hold a regulatory compact with the city that they're providing. But often we see that compact is being broken because they're supposed to be providing services for the public good. But because of their entrenched investment in the fossil fuel infrastructure that is hurting our communities and polluting our communities, their commitment to running large profits, and their political meddling, we've seen them go in exactly the opposite direction. They aren't trying to transition us towards a system of, as we call it, energy democracy, or a system in which we have equitable and just renewable energy system. And, just to give a little bit of nuance there and what I mean, as I mentioned, Pepco actually was pushing back on a lot of the commitments that we had for renewable energy. And we see this across the United States. We also see the massive political influence. So they often, investor-owned utilities leverage their political power, even as a regulated monopoly, to get what they want. And a great example is actually Pepco's the head kind of parent company called Exelon was just committed to paying a $200 million fine in Illinois for their meddling with the political system. And we also saw in Ohio today that actually the Speaker of the House was arrested for racketeering with First Energy, another investor-owned utility, for trying to get massive subsidies to save their nuclear energy plants. So it is true, and then it is true across the United States and in DC. One of the clearest examples in a campaign that preceded ours on many of the same tenets was to stop the Pepco-Exelon merger that made them a part of that parent company I just described. And they used the political machinations to get what they wanted, even though the communities of DC and the district didn't want to see themselves put into this larger, massive investor-owned utility. And as we know tonight, we actually do see a significant amount of economic exploitation that comes from that as well, because we are seeing that prices are constantly increasing on our communities, and that they're actually not investing in things like energy poverty, which we're seeing because they want to see a kind of increasing electricity prices. So I'm sure that our colleagues here will get into more of the details around energy poverty and how that plays into the rate case. So if we could move on. Yeah, so as I mentioned here, these are the different pieces of electricity power, and this image that is shown is actually of a local DC activist, Basav, and he is holding a sign from the previous protests that were there to stop the Exelon-Pepco merger, because they were afraid for the ramifications of a consolidated utility that for our renewable energy goals and for price hikes, just like the one we're going through right now with the rate case. Next. But there is this alternative, as I mentioned before. There's this alternative energy democracy in which we can actually resist fossil fuels and transition rapidly to democratically governed, community-controlled renewable energy. And for investor-owned utilities, that's not in the cards for them. Even if they allow us to transition away from fossil fuels, they want to own that future. They want to make sure that they are socializing the risk of moving into renewable energy, but they are gaining all of the profit. And so that's why we are advocating for a new alternative, or one that is actually alive and well in the United States, but is a public ownership of our energy system, so that we actually can take back, we can power DC, we can take back the grid, so that we are in charge, so that we can transition to renewable energy, make sure that it is a democratic institution, and ensure that we're handling issues of energy poverty in the district, and ensuring that everyone gains access to the benefits of the next system. So next slide. So yeah, I think just to end here, we are part of a much larger movement that's happening right now, in which there are communities that are fighting to own their grid so that they can build a just and renewable energy future. And a lot of that, some of the first steps are building relationships at this moment, fighting against utility injustice on things like a rate case. And I think that what we've seen is really powerful movements build, and I'm excited to have the district as a part of that really growing energy democracy and utility justice space. So I'm going to hand it over to the folks, now that we've kind of covered the larger frame for what we're trying to accomplish on the long term, to the immediate, real, material realities of something like a rate hike. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Johanna. If you have any questions for Johanna, please post them in the Q&A section. Our next speaker is Anjali Patel, Senior Assistant People's Counsel at DC's Office of the People's Counsel. Thanks for coming tonight, Anjali. Go ahead.
Thank you for having us. So good evening, everyone. On behalf of the People's Counsel, Ms. Sandra Madhavu-Fry, I would like to thank Tyler and DC for inviting OPC to share some thoughts on Pepco's current rate increase. I think we have to move a couple slides. There we go. So as the statutory advocate for DC ratepayers, OPC's mission is to advocate for electric service that is safe, reliable, resilient, and environmentally sustainable. OPC has been and continues to be fully supportive of the district's environmental goals, which the earlier presenters went over in quite a bit of detail. But we believe that it's important that we consider how best to achieve those goals in a manner that is cost effective and brings benefits to all 8 wards of the city. So as most of you are aware, that's why you're here tonight, is that Pepco has filed a very large rate increase. Pepco routinely files for rate increases, so it's not new that they come in asking for additional funds, but this application is different because Pepco is not only asking for a rate increase, it's also asking the Public Service Commission, or the PSC, to change the way it sets Pepco's rates. Traditionally, Pepco must come in each time that it wants a rate increase, and this gives our office and other stakeholders and the community members a chance to review the inputs and ensure that the costs are just and reasonable for ratepayers to pay. Over the last several rate cases, based on OPC's advocacy on behalf of ratepayers, the PSC has approved rates that are less than half of what Pepco asked for. In some cases, in the last rate case, it was actually a refund to ratepayers because there was some changes in the federal tax law. And so Pepco came in for a rate increase and came out with crediting ratepayers' funds. These rate cases are a very important way to ensure that Pepco's requests are reasonable. So in this case, though, Pepco has asked for the commission to change its rate design. If we could go to the next slide, that'd be helpful. Thank you. So there's regular standards. All rate cases must be just and reasonable. This just gives you a breakdown of some of the parts of the code that tell the commission you can't approve any rate increase. It has to balance the utilities and the consumer's interests. And if you don't mind switching to the next slide. But Pepco is, in this case, it's asking for something called a multi-year rate plan. So it wants 3 years. Multi-year rate plans can vary, but in Pepco's case, they're asking for 3 successive rate increases so annual rate increases over 3 years. The commission has to find not only is the rate increase just and reasonable, but they also have to find that the proposed rate making standard protects consumers ensures the quality, availability, and reliability of regulated electric service, and is in the interest of the public. And additionally, because Pepco does actually already operate under several forms of alternative rate making, so this isn't, we're not stuck in the Stone Ages in DC, which Pepco does try to say that we are. We have several forms of alternative rate making already in place, including a decoupling mechanism that is supposed to avoid disincentives to invest in energy efficiency. Pepco also gets a surcharge for undergrounding lines, so that way it doesn't have to wait to recoup the investment of this resiliency initiative. So further changes may be warranted for Pepco with respect to Pepco's rate making, but OPC and others want to make sure that these are the right changes and that they don't result in negative impacts for ratepayers. The Commission has recognized that this is a sea change of what Pepco has proposed is completely different than anything we've addressed in the past. And so in December, after a lengthy technical conference and comment period, the Commission issued Order 20273. For those of you who are interested, you can pull all of these orders up on the Commission website. And that order lays out 10 criteria for which the Commission plans to review Pepco's proposal. These criteria include examining things like, does Pepco's proposal align with and advance the district's modernization, environmental, and climate policies and goals? They ask whether the mechanism provides benefits that are measurable, quantitative, and qualitative to customers, and not just benefits to the utility. So Pepco has, its current application has 3 parts. If we can go to the next slide. They, in May, sorry, it's a little bit, the text is a little small on here, but last year, May 30th on 2019, Pepco filed its initial application for a multi-year rate plan. And they asked the Commission to approve a $162 million rate increase. So this isn't just $162 million in rates, it's $162 million above what they are currently getting. And that would be put into effect between 2020 and 2022. They also asked for a 10.3% return on equity, which means the investment, the capital that their shareholders provide to the company, they wanted a 10.3% return on it. So if you think about your own bank accounts and the interest rates that are out there in the world right now, this is much higher than any other industry or individual gets. Then they also proposed performance incentive mechanisms where they would get financial incentives if they met certain metrics. And they asked for an annual reconciliation mechanism. So 162 million, but hey, if they didn't reach their approved return, then they wanted additional money each year in order to meet the return that they were requesting. So OPC, in alternative, at the bottom, you'll see there's an alternative request. Pepco said that, okay, if you don't approve our MRP, we want a traditional rate increase of 88.6 million. Now they're kind of saying, well, we didn't actually ask for that alternative. We just have the original rate plan, but the Commission said the alternative, you have to file the alternative, and that is still on the table. So OPC, we reviewed Pepco's original proposal. We spent a lot of time and a lot of resources reviewing the proposal, and we found that the Commission should reject it. And the Commission should reject it because the original proposal doesn't meet the criteria that the Commission laid out for an alternative rate making proposal. It could harm customers, and it doesn't advance the district's environmental goals. It includes costly capital upgrades with no real alternatives to them. It includes performance incentive mechanisms that could allow Pepco to earn more money to deliver services that it's already required to provide and that ratepayers already fund. And it proposes to impose the majority of the rate increase on residential customers, which is inequitable and unaffordable. We also said that that they should reject the multi-year rate plan, and under the alternative application, its increase should be reduced by 2/3 of what they had asked for because there were inappropriate costs in that request. Including, for some of you may be interested in this, they asked for ratepayers to pay for environmental remediation of the Benning generating station, even though they agreed in 2000 that they would no longer impose those costs on ratepayers. So there was a lot of concern with what Pepco had originally filed. Every other party, in addition to OPC, that filed testimony on the multi-year rate plan, including the federal and the district government, told the commission they should reject Pepco's proposal. So this was an across the board, nobody liked it. Then COVID hit, and the world, as we all know, turned upside down. Rather than revise its proposal, Pepco doubled down and said, it filed testimony shortly after COVID hit, and they said, we need to keep going with what we've already filed. This is the right proposal. OPC, we told the commission, hey, look, these are big impacts. We don't know what these impacts are going to be. Pepco's proposal was based all on forecasted costs in the future. We're not sure what's going to happen in the future. Let's take a pause and wait till the pandemic ends and then take a look and see what would be the right way to move forward. Unfortunately, the commission denied that request, but it did tell the parties, please address the impacts of COVID on Pepco's proposal in your next round of testimony. This was supposed to be our next and last round. So we've been litigating this for over a year. We were supposed to file one more round of testimony. Pepco took this simple request from the commission and turned it into opportunity to file a brand new proposal that nobody had considered before, what it's calling its enhanced MRP proposal. So it's, we're going to be submitting additional testimony on the proposal on Monday. All of our testimony, unless it's confidential, the confidential bits are protected, but almost all of our testimony is public. It's all available on the commission website. The bottom line, though, is Pepco has been putting out a lot of press on its enhanced MRP proposal, and the press is misleading. Pepco claims that this is a rate freeze. It is not a rate freeze. What they're planning to do is increase rates. They're asking that rates be increased by 135 million over basically 2 years, because 2020 is almost done. And then they would offset some of those rates so some customers wouldn't see an increase on their bill, potentially wouldn't see an increase on their bill, using offset funds. They also are asking for still asking for a reconciliation mechanism. So they're saying that at the end, while they've sort of reduced their amount, at the end of the 3 years, they want to come back and ask the commission to true them up if their costs are higher than what they think they're going to be. They have proposed some customer assistance programs as well. As I'm sure all of you are on the same page as us, customers are hurting right now, businesses are hurting right now, and there will be need for assistance programs. There just isn't a need to tie a $135 million rate increase to those programs. Those programs should be put into, it's our position that those programs should be put into effect and implemented regardless of what rate increase Pepco gets. So I just wanted to cover one more thing, if you don't mind going to the next slide. When Pepco, this slide is kind of busy, but what I want to point out is Pepco talks about these offsets to the rate increase. As you can see, sort of at the top, the majority of the rate increase is going to be proposed to be imposed on residential customers. That's the top box there. And when you look at the offsets that they proposed under each of these, almost all of them, when it says asset amortization, additional subtraction modification, what they're talking about are funds that are the customer's own funds. So when tax laws changed and when there was some changes to other issues, there's money that Pepco has to return to customers over time. And or that money the customers will have to pay over time. They're not saying we're not gonna ask customers to pay. What they're saying is we're gonna accelerate the refund. So it's your money that's gonna pay for the offset, or we're gonna pause collecting this money and then we'll come back and collect it again in 3 years. So there's no freeze. They're just offsetting what they're saying the rate increase will be. At the end of the 3 years, those offsets go away. Actually, at the end of 2 years, those offsets start going away. So what they're trying to do is, what they are doing is at the end of 3 years, you're gonna get 135 million rate increase plus the additional next rate increase. And the last slide that I have is just some information if you would like to get involved in the case, some methods to get involved.
All right, thanks so much for that, Anjali. Now, unfortunately, Anjali has to get off the call early, so we're going to go ahead and give her a moment to answer some of the questions that she has received, from my understanding.
Would it be possible to read the questions out, because
Yeah, one moment. Let's see. Let me
I'm
get
sorry, my
access to
screen
them.
isn't working.
No, no worries. One moment.
Harry, there were several questions about the Public Service Commissioner. So I think that that might be a good direction to ask Anjali to go in. You know, what significance is the missing Public Service Commissioner? What role does the OPC have, if any? And what actions can the public take regarding the opening and having someone who is supportive of the renewable energy goals and the consumer interest of the DC public?
Good question. OPC isn't involved in picking the public service commissioner. That is done by the mayor's office, and depending on who they bring on, they could change or could not. It's unclear. It depends on who there is. I've heard a number of names bandied around, but I don't know if there's any. I think there's a lot going on in the district right now, and I'm not sure where the mayor's office is in terms of appointing one person. There will be, once the mayor nominates an individual, there will be a council hearing. There's an opportunity to provide testimony at that point.
Awesome. Okay. And it looks like we have another question from Aaron Hudson, who asks, what is the current read on the DC PSC commissioners? Who is for and against the plan? And who is a swing vote?
Right now, there's only two commissioners, Chairman Phillips and Commissioner Beverly. If I had to read tea leaves, it's hard to say that this case has been changing throughout the time. It's one of the most complicated cases we've had to deal with. Normal rate cases are a little easier to read. With this one, it's clear that the commission is very interested in alternative forms of rate making, but whether they are convinced that Pepco's is the right one or not is questionable. I think this is why it's important for folks to get involved and provide their input to the commission on what your thoughts are about the rate increase and whether it's appropriate, because that way they can hear from those who will be impacted by it.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Also, we have another question from Andrea. Pepco asking, if Pepco wanted, could they extend these customer protections to DC residents without raising rates, excuse me?
Yes, they could. A number of utilities around the country have been working on consumer protections outside of a rate case, and actually OPC had put in a petition to the commission to start a task force to look at COVID-related concerns and COVID-related customer programs that would be needed in the district. That the commission has said that they will hold a technical conference after the pandemic. The mayor lifts the emergency order, but I think, you know, it's our opinion that that should be done sooner than later. And that's another thing. It's that case is formal case number 1164. That's another gray area for the consumers, the public to speak up on, tell the commission things need to be started now.
Excellent. Thank you. It looks like that's all the questions we had. Are there any other questions? And we have a minute left for Q&A for Anjali before she has to head out and we move on. No?
Well, thank you for having us. If you have
Yes.
any questions, feel free to contact our office.
Yes, thanks so much for that, Anjali. We appreciate it. All right, so our next speaker Our next speaker is Tyler Fitch. Tyler's a member of the Metro DC DSA and a part of the We Power DC coalition. Go ahead, Tyler.
Thanks so much, Harry. Hey, y'all. My name's Tyler, pronouns are he, him, and I'm part of the We Power DC coalition, and I'm going to take a few minutes to give you We Power DC's perspective on the rate case and what we can do about it. We just heard from OPC, and it's clear that Pepco makes these rate increases really hard to understand. I mean, the spreadsheets are just really hard to track. So when we looked into it, we found things that are really troublesome, and that's why we're organizing. So I'm just going to run through a little bit of it. No matter which version of the rate case, whether it's the enhanced MRP or the single year, Pepco is still asking to raise DC's bills by $139 million. That means they would make over $200 million every year off of DC residents. And like I said, they're using a complicated regulatory process to push through the ability to raise rates every single year. Like OPC said, the commission should reject it because it hurts customers and it doesn't get us closer to our climate goals. DC residents shouldn't have to pay for corporate profits, and especially not during an economic crisis. And when it comes down to it, Pepco has two reasons it gives about why it needs this rate increase. First, they can't afford to run the grid without it. And second, DC can't hit its climate goals without the rate hike. So let's take a look at both of those. Next slide. So does Pepco need a price hike to afford running the grid? No. Let me state that more clearly, absolutely not. Pepco Holdings made $110 million of pure profit in the first quarter of 2020 alone. And while we're paying the bills, executives are telling shareholders they can expect even more profit after they push these rate increases through. The last time Pepco came in for a rate increase in DC, the commission actually found that they should decrease rates instead of increase them. The people who are struggling to pay are ratepayers, not the company. DC's unemployment rate is still at 12%, up 10% from where it was before coronavirus. And for many low-income customers in the district, power is already unaffordable. Even before COVID hit, a quarter of DC residents were eligible for low-income energy assistance, but only a quarter of those got the support that they needed. So these customers were paying double the international standard for energy poverty for their energy. And during an unprecedented economic and public health emergency, when we're encouraged to stay inside, this is more important than ever. Next slide. So second, does Pepco need the price hike to meet DC's clean energy goals? If you read their literature, they'll tell you absolutely, but the answer is no. And when it comes down to it, none of this price hike is going towards making DC a cleaner city. Our friends at OPC actually, for this case, took a Pepco executive in for a deposition where they asked them about this. And I have a little bit of the transcript here. They asked, your representatives say climate initiatives are not included in this rate case budget. Is that right? And the Pepco executive agreed. Even though they keep telling ratepayers they need this money to clean up their grid. Grid only has 6% clean electricity, and Pepco has made no plan to make it cleaner. And the Solar for All program in DC is intended to provide affordable solar panel for 100,000 low-income households here. And so far, Pepco's interconnected, I think, 364 of them. So Pepco's falling down in its climate goals, and this rate increase is not going to help. Next slide. Finally, coronavirus turned everything on its head. This graph shows the events of the rate case against DC's unemployment rate. And what you can see is the unemployment rate has climbed to unprecedented heights. And the consumer advocates actually requested that this rate case be suspended because simply no one knew what was going to happen in the future with coronavirus, but we did know that DC residents were struggling. But the DC Public Service Commission rejected OPC's motion and they kept it going. And then Pepco filed this enhanced proposal, which is a complete distraction. If Pepco wanted to protect ratepayers, they wouldn't need to increase rates. Essentially what they're doing is, I don't want to put this too strongly, but it's sort of a form of blackmail where they say, we'll protect customers as long as you guarantee us this rate increase. So that's why we have to do something. Pepco doesn't need this rate increase. It won't help DC residents, and they can't afford it during this crisis. We need to make our voices heard at the Public Service Commission that this rate case is not acceptable, especially during a pandemic. That's why we, Power DC, along with you all, are working to stop this rate case. And we'll talk about how you can get involved at the end of this presentation. Thanks so much, y'all. Back to you, Harry.
All right, that was excellent, Tyler. Thank you. Next up, we have Marley Kasdan, an organizer with 350 DC. Take it away, Marley.
Thanks, Harry. So I'm Marley, she, her pronouns, an organizer with 350 DC and a member of the We Power DC coalition. And I'm going to give an overview of the No Pepco Pledge campaign. So as we've heard, we know that Pepco has pursued multiple rate increases over the past few years. They've worked to weaken DC's ambitious climate legislation. And as a corporate utility with deep pockets, they have influenced the DC Council with donations and concerted lobbying efforts. So to combat Pepco's corporate influence over the DC Council and to pressure elected officials to fight for a just and equitable energy transition, our coalition started the No Pepco Pledge campaign in October 2019. Next slide, please. So to combat Pepco's, so the pledge has asked council members and candidates running for DC Council to sign on to this pledge to demonstrate their commitment to people over profits and energy democracy. By signing this pledge, candidates agree to and acknowledge that Pepco's interest in DC energy and climate policy is driven by profits rather than the health of families, climate, and democracy. And therefore, all of the signatories commit to the following actions. 1, they commit to reject all contributions from Pepco, Washington Gas, and other fossil fuel companies. 2, to voluntarily disclose all meeting times and topics with Pepco and Washington Gas representatives and lobbyists, and to take and make available detailed minutes of all of these meetings. And 3, to support legislation for an economic feasibility study on the implementation of alternative utility models, such as community choice aggregation or municipalization in DC. So now this last point on the pledge about a feasibility study for models of public ownership is especially critical to building support and laying the foundation for public ownership of the utility. And as Johanna previously outlined in her section on energy democracy, public ownership can benefit DC residents by allowing us to reinvest profits in the DC community, and it will help us to achieve our ambitious climate goals. Next slide, please. So after crafting the pledge and starting to reach out to candidates running for council, our coalition publicly launched the No Pepco Pledge campaign in early October 2019. We actually did this at an action outside of the DC Chamber of Commerce's State of the District and Region event. And this event was actually sponsored by Pepco, which demonstrates Pepco's cozy relationship and influence with the district's economic activities and power brokers, which is one of the main things that we're hoping this campaign can break. So at the launch event, we had candidates running for city council come and speak about energy democracy in the district and why they've signed on to the pledge. Our speakers included Janice Lewis-George, a Ward 4 council candidate, Daniel Hernandez from Ward 2, Kelvin Brown from Ward 7, and Anthony Lorenzo Green, also running for council in Ward 7. And at this launch event, these candidates came and talked about why they're fighting for energy democracy in the district. And then in the months leading up to the June 2020 primary, our coalition continued to reach out to other candidates running for council. And in the end, we had 7 candidates running for ward level races who signed on to the No Pepco Pledge. Next slide. And what was even more exciting, go on to the next slide, please. Thanks. And what was even more exciting about us and this No Pepco Pledge is that Janice Lewis-George, who's a progressive champion and the first signatory of the No Pepco Pledge, is that she won her primary race in Ward 4. And as a climate and racial justice advocate, our coalition is looking forward to working with Janice to achieve our vision for energy democracy in the district. Next slide, please. However, the race for at-large candidates for DC Council is coming up in November, and our coalition has continued to reach out to candidates to ask them to sign on to the pledge. So far, we have at-large candidates Ed Lazier, Christina Henderson, and Will Merrifield who signed on to the No Pepco Pledge. And as we continue our outreach, we're hoping to collect more sign-ons and raise awareness about Pepco's influence as a bad actor, particularly as Pepco is pursuing a rate increase in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're also continuing to build support for energy democracy in DC. So while it's critical that we pressure the Public Service Commission to reject Pepco's request for a rate increase in the immediate term, our goal over the long term as a coalition is to achieve public ownership of the utility for the benefit of DC residents. And public ownership can be achieved by passing legislation through the City Council, which makes this fight for energy democracy an important electoral issue for the upcoming election in November. while we're simultaneously working to fight Pepco's rate increase this summer. Thanks, and back to you, Harry.
Thanks, Marley. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A section. Our next speaker is Ren Patton, an organizer with the DC hub of the Sunrise Movement, who are building an army of young people to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process. The floor is yours, Ren.
Hey, thanks, Harry. And thanks to Johanna and Anjali and Tyler and Marley for dropping so much knowledge. I have learned so much in just the last week of joining the prep meetings for this town hall. So I thought what I'd share with you all is why we're so excited at Sunrise to be a part of this coalition. Because storytelling is a big part of our culture at Sunrise. We tell our stories and we honor each other's stories because we've all got something to lose from climate change. And that's how we're going to connect with each other to stop it, is by feeling each other's stories. So I want to tell you about a beautiful fall morning last October when I attended a celebration. It was to celebrate a brand new ground-mounted solar array on the grounds of a church next to a huge cemetery in Northeast DC, Ward 5. It was just off of Rhode Island. Google Maps says it was the Monastery of Our Lady, Mount Carmel. And the project was led by Counsel. They're a local nonprofit working here in the district to develop shared community solar projects. And they were calling this morning celebration a project blessing. The friars from the monastery were there, like in their robes, offering a blessing over the solar panels and a blessing for the 50 local households who would be receiving subscriptions to the project at no cost, which would cut their electricity bills in half. And the sun was shining, the field of solar panels was glistening, the air was full of like warm, fuzzy feelings, and a lot of the partners involved in the project were there to give a congratulatory speech. And someone from Pepco was there because they had played a role in the project. And I don't remember what their formal remarks were, but I remember their reaction when someone else was talking. Someone was talking about what a great accomplishment this project was, and how it was so hard, and how it took so long, and how we've got to find ways to scale up community solar because it can benefit the community while helping us reach our ambitious climate goals. And we have to stop making that so difficult. We need new models like shared community solar. It shouldn't be so hard from like a regulatory and financing perspective to do innovative local projects that have so many potential benefits for the people involved. Because after all, this person pointed out, DC has one of the most ambitious clean energy standards in the country, which is that we'll be powered by 100% clean renewable energy by 2032. And the guy from Pepco openly scoffed at that statement, that we'd be 100% renewable by 2032. Like, he laughed out loud at the thought of it. I mean, for one, like, way to not read the room. We're at a groundbreaking for a community solar project, but also just like, really? Really, like, that's a laughable goal, because that is exactly the kind of ambition and timeline science demands. We must decarbonize in the next decade, full stop. And if our existing utilities aren't going to be willing partners in that transition, then they need to get out of the way, because ain't no one got time for utility boys who think our climate goals are funny. This is serious, like, this is dead serious. Actually, in a country where 1 in 3 American households are struggling to pay their energy bills even before COVID. Poor households were already keeping their homes hot in the summer to avoid large utility bills. And now, with so many jobs lost because of COVID, with so many people facing evictions if they can't pay their rent, you think they're gonna be able to pay higher utility bills? No, like, they're not. They're gonna suffer, and some of them are gonna die in this heat. We're facing a heat dome of high pressure this summer over the entire US, which means it's gonna be hotter for longer, and it's getting hotter for longer every year. And it's 100 degrees in Siberia right now, and that's not normal. And all of these compounding crises are hitting the same people the hardest. The COVID crisis, the economic crisis, the climate crisis are hitting BIPOC communities the hardest. That's Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC. Like, just look at DC, right? Like, where are the hottest places in the city? It's the places without any trees and parks, where the urban heat island effect compounds the heat. Who lives in the neighborhoods without trees? Who lives in the neighborhoods that were already energy burdened before COVID? It's the Black communities who have called DC home for generations, and we have got to do better. We actually can create a city that is just, economically just, racially just, climate just. We have the solutions already. We know what policies will work. We call it a Green New Deal. We call it energy democracy. And we were super excited to throw down for Denise Lewis George, who also shares that vision for our city. Because like we at Sunrise have a lot more faith in the people of this city getting it right than a utility like Pepco looking out for the interests of their shareholders. So let's go. We're excited. Let's reject this rate case. Let's keep right on agitating. Like we're ready for this one. I'll throw it back to you, Harry.
Rin, thank you so much. That was very passionate, right in line with the energy we need for this. Thanks. We're joined now by Kaya Chatterjee. Kaya is a mom, executive director of U.S. Climate Action, a co-founder of Arm in Arm DC, board chair of Sunrise Movement, and a candidate for ANC 6A01. Go ahead, Kaya.
Thanks, Harry, and thank you so much, Ren, for sharing that outrageous story from Pepco. Not only has Pepco completely failed to take any leadership on the climate crisis for decades, but I wanted to come today to point out that Pepco has also poisoned our rivers. We talked about the Anacostia River earlier today, and Anjali mentioned the Benning Road facility. And that has been a major factor in why our rivers in Washington, D.C. are currently not swimmable, on top of climate change being a factor because we literally get poop in our rivers because we're experiencing more heavy downpours because of the climate crisis here in D.C. So Pepco has definitely been poisoning our rivers, and right now we are demanding that we get our rivers back. And poisoned rivers are especially infuriating in the middle of a heat wave when it would just feel amazing if there was like a dock and we could just go jump in the river. And in the middle of COVID, where the pools are closed, we don't have cooling facilities at nearly the same rates. For folks who don't know the history of the Benning Road facility, it was a power plant that was built along the Anacostia River, a deep environmental injustice when that happened. They didn't build it in the Palisades, they didn't build it along the Potomac, they built it there and they left toxics there. And so this Saturday, we are going to wear masks and do an action Saturday morning. We're gonna bike from the Anacostia River to Roosevelt Island. We're gonna wade in the water, which is technically illegal in DC, and as I mentioned, is a bit polluted, so a little bit of risk there. We're gonna pick up some trash and then we're gonna ride over to Pepco and we're gonna leave some of it there with signs about how Pepco has polluted our rivers with invisible poison and through the climate crisis, and that we demand our rivers back. So I'm gonna put in the chat a link to our petition. I'm gonna show off my little sign here. Pepco, stop the climate crisis, clean our rivers, stop raising our rates. I've written some letters. I invite everybody to make some signs and join us and leave some trash in front of Pepco. Show them what's what. Thank you.
Wonderful, Kaya. Thanks. That sounds lit. I'm excited. Hopefully you all can see the link that she provided in the chat. I see it. If you don't, let me know. Let us know. Thanks again to all our amazing speakers. We're going to start the Q&A in just a second, but first, we want to encourage you all to take action against the rate case. Laura, will you provide more information on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Harry. So after listening to all of our really amazing speakers, it's clear that Pepco and its plans for our local electric service are not sustainable for our community for so many reasons. The most urgent issue at this point is Pepco's proposed rate increase, which, as Harry mentioned, they're trying to push through despite the detrimental effects COVID is having on the economy, and thus residents' paychecks and their ability to pay bills, including utilities. Like Anjali and Tyler discussed, Pepco's trying to sell this as something that is necessary for them to function and for meeting environmental goals, and that only minimally impacts utility consumers' bills, but that's just not true. The rate increase will have a negative impact on utility bills. Not only that, but Pepco does not have any stated plans to meet our city's environmental goals. I encourage everyone to read OPC's fact sheet, which I can drop in the chat to learn more. We Power DC has drafted a letter to the Public Service Commission, which, as you learned, has the power to approve or reject Pepco's rate increase application. This letter lays out why the rate increase should be rejected, and it includes additional demands that we also believe are necessary. An economic feasibility study to look into alternate models, like Johanna discussed, reconnections of utilities that have been shut off due to payment issues, utility debt cancellations, and a ban on utility shutoffs and evictions, as well as a city council-wide commitment to rejecting Pepco donations. This letter will go both to the Public Service Commission and to all council members. The more pressure we can put on these entities, the more likely we will succeed in both the rejection of the current rate increase and our ultimate goal of transitioning to a publicly owned utility. We want to ask that all of you send your own letter to the Public Service Commission expressing your opposition to the rate increase, telling them how this affects you personally and why this issue is important to you. Tell the Commission why you believe that this increase is unacceptable. We will provide a link for where you can read our letter and write your own, and we'll also include this in a follow-up email. Some other actions: eventually the Public Service Commission will hold hearings, either virtually or in person, which will include an opportunity for residents to testify about the rate increase. They have not set these yet, but we're closely monitoring news about this, and when we have more information, we're going to send that information about the hearings to our mailing list. We really hope we can have a strong, unified presence at that hearing, providing testimony calling for a rejection of the rate increase. And then, as Kaya mentioned, this Saturday, you can join Arm in Arm DC and go put some trash on Pepco's front door. And finally, if you would like to get involved with V-Power DC in a more hands-on way, we'd really love to have you in our coalition. Please shoot us an email at vpowerdc@gmail.com to join us. We're excited to have you with us, continuing to work toward a just transition to a utility that serves everybody in DC. Back to you, Harry.
All right, thank you so much, Laura. All right, we have a few questions here for our panelists for Q&A. I'm just going to start with a question we have from Jack. And his question is, isn't this more about Exelon than Pepco?
Yeah, this is Andrea. I'm sorry, I was asked to take that one. So I answered this a little bit in the chat, but Exelon, being the parent company of Pepco, is really relevant. I mean, they're the investor-owned utility. They are a nuclear producer who bought the ability to bring power to DC. They really are a wires company, as we discussed before in DC in terms of Pepco. There are numerous communities across the country who are getting together and holding these type of events and building these types of coalitions to go against the various local utilities that are owned by Exelon. We can view this in two ways. We can view this as, nationally, we realize the problem with privately held investor-owned utilities. So in some ways, it's the future of America and our renewable goals versus large investor-owned utilities that don't want to move. But we can also see it in the way that we've brought it today, that is about local communities working with or against, depending upon where they go, local utilities to build community-owned or community-controlled power that makes sense for them. And so the Democratic Socialists of America's Eco-Socialist Working Group is working to coordinate these actions across the country, bring these people together that are working on the various actions so they can talk to each other. But right now in DC, it's We Power DC fighting against Pepco. And that's sort of the decision that we've made and the angle that we're taking right now, working against a known entity locally rather than against a gigantic, super well-funded mega corporation.
Great, thanks Andrea for answering that question. Our next question is from John, who asks, have any current members of the DC Council signed your No Pepco pledge? If not, what do they say is the reason why they won't sign your pledge?
Thanks, Harry. I can take that question. So yes, we had a number of candidates running for council sign on to the pledge, which was really exciting. As we mentioned, Janice Lewis-George, who won her Ward 4 council seat, signed on to the pledge, and she'll be joining the council. So that was incredibly exciting. And we had a couple other candidates running for DC Council who had also signed on to the pledge, who didn't end up winning their seats, but they had signed on, which was very exciting. And as we mentioned before, there are a few candidates who are still running in the election coming up, the general election in November, who have signed on to the pledge. That's Christina Henderson, Ed Lazier, and Will Merrifield have all signed on, and they're all candidates for council. In terms of candidates who declined to sign on to the pledge, a few gave varying answers. Some were not on board with our goals of energy democracy and public ownership of the utility, so they weren't comfortable signing a pledge that would commit them to supporting a study to look into those models if they didn't agree with our idea for public ownership. Others said they were uncomfortable with the provision about providing more transparency by making minutes available of meetings that they would take with Pepco executives and lobbyists. Some said that they felt that having to disclose those meetings would hamper their ability to kind of either work backroom deals or talk with their constituents and or just do their job of legislating, which we thought was a bit ridiculous, since more transparency can help with community oversight of the council, and we think that's a really important tenet. So those were kind of the two main reasons that candidates gave for not wanting to sign on. Yeah, thanks, and back over to you, Harry.
All right, thank you for that comprehensive response, Marley. Appreciate that. Let's see, so we have another question from Erin that was mentioned in the chat. And it says, she asks, one thing we didn't talk about specifically is the jobs provided by a locally owned utility. But one of the colleagues on the call pointed out that Pepco has many outsourced/contractor jobs that pay at near or minimum wage. On the other side, DC Water has fair wages. What other community benefits could locally owned utilities bring?
Hey, thanks, Harry. And I can start this one, but if other folks have thoughts, they can jump on too. So we know from what they've said in their rate case that Pepco actually uses contractors instead of laborers at the prevailing wage. And the reason they do that is to cut costs. And it's not safe for people who receive electricity. It's not safe for the workers. And the reason they do that is because they're trying to maximize their profit. And simply put, a community-owned public utility system would not have that incentive, and we can invest in our workers in ways that make our community stronger. I think the other benefits that Erin talked about, I would say a publicly owned utility is more likely to invest in infrastructure and jobs and basically stimulus within DC's boundaries, whereas Pepco, that's now owned by Exelon, their incentives are absolutely to move that money outside. So in that way, the community benefits are because a publicly owned utility would want to continue to invest in its people. And then the last thing I think is, in terms of affordability and air quality, a publicly owned utility that's publicly accountable to the people is going to make sure that it does right by its people, especially if there's groups like We Power DC that can keep them accountable. So they would be encouraged to keep prices low, and they'd be encouraged to make sure that our air and our water are clean. So kind of a win-win here. And that's all I got, Harry. I'm not sure if anyone else wants to jump on, but I think that's it.
All right, thank you, Tyler. Seeing none other. Yeah, I guess I certainly want to thank everyone who could attend this digital town hall event and all coalition members and partners who came together to make it possible. I would like to end by reiterating the action items mentioned by Laura so that you could get involved as soon as possible with what we've discussed here this evening. So firstly, we ask that all of you send your own letter to the Public Service Commission expressing opposition to the rate case, why you find it personally harmful and unacceptable. A link has been provided for you to submit your own, and will be included in our follow-up email to you all. Secondly, we will notify you all as soon as we are certain of when the Public Service Commission will hold virtual or in-person meetings, allowing us to show up in a strong display of solidarity to testify about the rate increase. Thirdly, we have placed a link to the Facebook event for protesting Pepco's pollution of the Anacostia River with Arm in Arm DC. And last but most certainly not least, we want to invite you all to attend the We Power DC organizing meetings via Zoom that happen every Wednesday. And the next one that will be occurring will be next Wednesday, that's July 29th. So without further ado, everyone have a great evening, stay safe, and we hope to see you all soon.